Welcome, everybody. Welcome to psychology. Today, we're in this first little unit. We're going to be talking about the history of psychology, where it has its roots in, what fields have influenced psychology, some key players in psychology that you're going to need to know, as well as some major approaches that are used in contemporary psychology today, some major psychological approaches, and you might see some of the names or some concepts have an asterisk by them. That just means that I'm going to do a deeper dive episode later in the future. But right now, we're doing a short, quick introduction to some major approaches and some very influential psychologists. So we get to what is psychology? Well, originally it was the study of mental processes, but it's later evolved to include behavior as well. So it's the study of mental processes and behavior. Psychology is, of course, influenced and has been influenced by other fields, including structuralism, functionalism, gestalt psychology, behaviorism, and psychoanalysis. Psychology also has its roots in two other very broad fields, philosophy and physiology, and scholars from both of these fields began to explore the mind in the 1870s. So, one very influential psychologist is named Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt. He made psychology an independent science. He established the first laboratory designed for psychological experiments in 1879. He's known today as the founder of contemporary psychology. Under Wundt, psychology became the study of conscious experience, and during his experiments, the scientific method was always used. So he kind of brought psychology out of this age of kind of folklore and where it's rooted in phrenology and stuff that's not as scientific. He brought it from that into a more scientific field, and he kind of made it into a science. Then we get to G. Stanley Hall. He studied with Wundt and he was responsible for the spread of psychology to America. He opened the first American Psychology Lab in 1883, and he ran the first psychology-focused journal in the U.S. He also assisted in the creation of the APA. So now we get to structuralism. Structuralism was one of the influences on psychology, and it was created by Edward Titchener. Structuralism is devoted to uncovering the basic structures that make up the mind and the thoughts. Structuralists analyze the components of consciousness, like how our sensations, feelings, and other things related to each other. They rely heavily on introspection to study consciousness. So, for example, patients are given certain objects, such as a rose, and they're asked to smell the rose, and what memories do those smells evoke, and why do you think that smell of a rose evokes this certain memory, stuff like that. That's introspection. And that's a very important concept in structuralism. However, structuralism died down in popularity because introspection doesn't always work. So sometimes we just don't know why certain smells evoke certain memories or why certain things feel good and other things feel bad. So structuralism did eventually die down. Then we get to functionalism. Functionalism was created by William James and heavily influenced the work of James Cattell and John Dewey. William James himself was influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. Functionalists believe that mental processes are best understood in terms of their adaptive purpose. Where structuralists believe that the components of consciousness should be analyzed, functionalists believe that the purpose of consciousness should be analyzed. Why are we conscious? Why do we think this way? Things like that. Like, what's the adaptive quality? Why was it evolutionarily beneficial to be conscious or be conscious in this way? Functionalists also believe that certain people's brains evolved in such a way that made them better at certain tasks than others. So, I'm sure you all know somebody who's like really good at drawing, or somebody who can do calculations in their head. Well, functionalists would say that there's an adaptive reason for that. Their brain adapted in a way that made them better at those tasks than other people. So, of course, you get to William James. He wrote the book Principles of Psychology. He took Darwin's ideas about natural selection and applied them to humans, asking questions like how did consciousness help humans in an evolutionary aspect. Then we get to James Cattell and John Dewey, who are both influenced by William James, and they explored mental testing and intelligence testing and were interested in how people adapt their behavior to meet the demands of reality. So, of course, philosophy and biology, both of these influence psychology's development, which leads into a conversation about Socrates and Plato. These both are philosophers who heavily influence psychology, and they both believe that the mind is separate from the body and that the mind continues after the physical body dies. And this is a concept known as dualism. So they were dualists. Then we get to Aristotle, who's actually mentored by Plato, but he disagreed with him on the mind-body relationship. He believed that knowledge grows from our experiences. Then we get to Rene Descartes, who believes kind of in a concept that's between them. It's called interactive dualism. So he believed that the mind and the body are separate, but they do interact with each other. So it's kind of a middle ground theory. Now, this is one of the most important debates going on in psychology, and it's the nature versus nurture debate. Goes back to the mind-body debate as well. It's in relation to that. This debate goes back as far as you can go, as far as like back to Aristotle and Plato and Socrates' time. The debate is even in there. It's basically the debate over, are we influenced by our genes, which is nature, or are we a product of our environment, which is nurture? Or could it be something in between? Hopefully by the end of this course you'll realize that we are both shaped by our genetics and our environment. So we get to empiricism, which was created by John Locke. This also influenced psychology to some extent. Empiricists believed knowledge comes from experience. They used direct observation and experimentation. John Locke also believed in something called tabula rasa, which is a very important idea. It's an idea that when you're born, your mind is a blank slate, and as you grow up and you have experience, that slate is filled up with knowledge. So that idea that knowledge is gained from experience. John Locke believed people gain knowledge solely from experiences. Empiricism did die down, however, because it was kind of it was difficult to be an empiricist. It brought up some very tough debates with answers that were impossible. Answers like, well, they would be asking questions like, well, does anything exist? And sometimes that answer would be no. So it kind of died down for that. It was kind of impossible to be an empiricist, I suppose. Then we get to behaviorism. It was created by John Watson. B.F. Skinner became a prominent behaviorist. B.F. Skinner is a name you're going to hear a lot. He's a very infamous behavioral psychologist. So behaviorists focus on the study of observable behavior and not mental processes, which distinguishes them from a lot of other fields in psychology, is that they focus on strictly observable behavior. Behaviorists believe that learning occurs through rewards and consequences. Another behaviorist, which is also infamous, which you might have heard of, is Ivan Pavlov. So he did the Pavlov's dogs experiment, getting them to drool at just the sound of a bell, and he did that through rewards, which we'll get to in a later chapter. Now we get some more infamous people in psychology. We get to Mary Whiton Calkins, who is the first female president of the APA, and she developed one of the first psychology-focused labs in America, along with G. Stanley Hall, of course. Then we get to Margaret Floyd Washburn, who is the first woman to receive her PhD in psychology. She was the author of the book The Animal Mind, which led to the creation of behaviorism. Then we get to Letta Stetter Hollingworth, who pioneered research on educational development and abnormal psychology. So she did quite a lot. So here is a very important concept in psychology. Excuse me. It's the three levels of analysis. It's the idea that there are three complementary views to analyze any given psychological phenomenon. Uh, these three views, otherwise known as approaches, are the biological approach, the psychological approach, and the sociocultural approach. And together these form what's known as the biopsychosocial approach, which combines all three approaches to analyze psychological phenomena. And the biopsychosocial approach is um, important in the respect that that's what a lot of contemporary psychologists are. They're biopsychosocial psychologists. They use all three of these and combine them into. They use all three approaches and use them to explain any given psychological phenomena. So here's an example of a biopsychosocial approach. Imagine that it's close to lunchtime and you begin to feel hungry. Why do you feel hungry? Well, the biological approach would say your lateral hypothalamus gives your body the signal to begin eating. So the biological approach is always about hormones and brain chemicals and things like that. The psychological approach is you were just thinking about the last time you ate. So it's cognition. The psychological approach is uh, like active thoughts, cognition, things that are going on in your psyche. Then there's the sociocultural approach, which says the culture you live in has determined that people eat 3 meals a day and one of them is at noon. So the sociocultural approach obviously looks at this society and the culture surrounding any given situation. So we have 7 very important psychological approaches in contemporary psychology. These are the most important approaches and are used to explain mental processes and behavior, although not all of them are used to treat abnormal psychology. So we have the biological approach, which I just mentioned, the cognitive approach, the psychodynamic approach, the humanistic approach, the behavioral approach, the social cultural approach, and the evolutionary approach. So the biological approach, it focuses on the brain, the body, neurons, and the nervous system. It focuses on how the brain is communicating with the body. It believes that humans are complex systems responding to hereditary and environmental influences, and that's what determines human nature. Biological psychologists believe that neural structures, biochemistry, and genetically predetermined responses to external signals determine human behavior. Then we get into the cognitive approach. Cognitive psychologists focus on how thought processes show we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. So some influential cognitive psychologists, which we will talk about, are Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. Cognitive psychologists believe that people are information processing systems, and that's what determines human behavior or human nature. And they believe that mental interpretation of experiences determines behavior. So maybe if you come home from school thinking that you had a bad day, for example, a cognitive psychologist would say, well, your interpretation of your day was that it was bad, but maybe you were just amplifying the negative experiences that you had that day. Maybe you slipped and you fell in a puddle and your clothes got all wet, but then at the same time maybe they were serving your favorite lunch in the cafeteria. So cognitive psychologists will say, you had a bad day, maybe it's because you were amplifying the clothes being wet, and maybe you should try to balance that out with the fact that they were serving your favorite lunch in the cafeteria or something similar to that. Then we get into the psychodynamic approach. Psychodynamic psychologists focus on unconscious conflicts and motives. Sigmund Freud is the father of psychodynamics. He's the father of a lot of psychology. He really helped pave the way for a lot of other fields of psychology. Sigmund Freud is going to appear a lot during this course. Sigmund Freud actually created psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis evolved into psychodynamics. So psychodynamic psychologists believe that humans are driven by malicious forces in the unconscious mind, and that's what determines human nature. And they also believe that unconscious needs, conflicts, repressed memories, and childhood experiences determines behavior. Also, Sigmund Freud is a very controversial psychologist, and a lot of his ideas are denounced today. But it's important to realize the influence that he's had on not only psychology but pop culture, and basically he has influenced a lot of things, despite his controversies. Then we get into the humanistic approach. Humanists focus on free will, improving self-esteem, self-concept, and meeting needs of love and acceptance. So your influential humanists are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. They emphasize that human potential and growth determine human nature. They believe behavior is determined by self-concept, perceptions, interpersonal relationships, and on a need for personal growth. And an important concept which you may have heard of, which we will talk about later, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's a very important idea to humanistic psychology, and that's something we will get to later. So the sociocultural approach, or the social cultural approach. Sociocultural psychologists focus on the impact of social factors on behavior and personality. So your influential sociocultural psychologists are Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram. They believe that people are social animals, so behavior must be interpreted in light of the social context surrounding a situation. They also believe that behavior is determined by cultures, social norms, expectations, and social learning. Then we get to the evolutionary approach. Evolutionary psychologists focus on natural selection. Your influential evolutionary psychologist is Charles Darwin. He's also like a Sigmund Freud type figure in that he's influenced so much of pop culture as well as the medical field, as well as so many other stuff, so many other things, so many other fields. They believe that human nature stems from behavior which is developed and adapted over a very long time, and they believe that natural selection determines behavior. However, it is important to note evolutionary psychology is used to explain certain psychological phenomenon, but not to treat psychological disorders. And the reason for that is all they do is they basically try to find an evolutionary explanation for a certain phenomenon, like why a person likes to eat so much sugary foods. Well, they might say that their brain has been hardwired and has adapted over centuries to be on the lookout for sugary foods, because sugary foods provide a lot of energy, for example. And back in our hunter-gatherer days, it was necessary to know that this certain food has a lot of sugar in it because that's a lot of energy in a time where we expended a lot of energy and we didn't necessarily know where our next meal was coming from. However, living in the 21st century, where we can get sugary foods at the snap of a finger, it might not be so useful. However, they can't treat it by saying that. It's just an explanation. So they don't treat psychological disorders, they just explain psychological phenomena. So now we're getting to the end of this presentation. We're getting to the end of this lesson. I want to go over something very important. Psychiatry versus psychology. There are some very important differences between these two fields. Psychiatry specializes in medicine. Psychiatrists are allowed to write prescriptions and they're trained in mental behavior. Psychologists, there's more than just the biochemical component that you'll find in psychiatry, and psychology is much more broad than psychiatry. So that's the end of this. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.